Hey there Dev Squad, Virtus here and welcome back to my C++ Fundamentals series. Within this episode, we're going to be showing you how you can use a loop to perform an action multiple times within our code while utilizing a for, while and do while loop. By the end of this video, you'll have a complete understanding of the different types of loops that you have available to you and the reason why and where you would use them within your code. So without further ado guys, let's go ahead and move on to an introduction to loops in C++ programming. So loops are essentially things that we can write in our code to perform an action multiple times, and generally we can do this using a condition. And doing this as part of a loop is going to allow us to keep our code efficient, clean, and very easily repeat an action within our code. There is a couple of different ways in which you can use loops, especially within game development. It's something that you are going to be using quite often. And the reason for that is, with the code that we've got here at the moment, it is just going to execute the code, and once it's finished, that is it. And with a video game, you want to keep it playing until the player dies or they exit the application. So having said that, you are going to be using a loop to check to make sure that the player is alive, and with that, if the player is still alive, then it's going to keep updating things like the health, moving characters, NPCs, and any other game mechanics that you are going to have. So hopefully you guys can see that loops is something very crucial to programming, especially with video game development. Now, there is other instances in which you would use loops. For example, if you simply just want to repeat an action a certain number of times, and we're going to be showing you how you can do this as part of a for loop, a while loop, or a do while loop as part of this video. So an example of why you'd want to do an action a specific number of times could be anything as simple as you want to spawn in a certain amount of enemies, and you do that with a loop instead of just copying that code over and over again and writing it 5 times. By doing it as part of a loop, you are going to be able to tie that to a condition, so you can change that condition over time, you can affect it with your code, and you're going to see this as we break down these types of loops. So without further ado guys, let's go ahead and move on to creating a for loop. So in this section we're going to be creating a for loop, and to make this nice and clear and easy for you guys to understand, I am going to remove the code that we created in the last episode where we put together an if statement. So take away your if statement and your else if statement and just give yourself a bit of blank space. Within here we are going to start off our for loop. Our for loop should always be started with the keyword for, and then with this what we need to do then is give ourselves some brackets which are going to contain 3 key pieces of information that need to be in there. So first and foremost, you have got a variable declaration which is going to be used for this for loop, and for us that is simply going to be int I equals 0, and then end off that statement with a semicolon. Now you can give this variable name any name that you want to. I have just used the variable name I out of convention, just essentially meaning iterator. Iterator being something which is going to go up 1 every time that we iterate on that. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about as we go further into this video. So we've got our variable declaration. The next thing that we need to have is a condition. This condition is essentially going to tell the compiler whether or not it should use this loop again, so if it should loop around and run the code within the body. Our condition is just going to be that I being the variable that we've just created, is less than 5. So I less than 5, and then we are going to end off this condition statement with a semicolon. If you want to learn more about conditions, it's definitely worth taking a look at my last video where I went through different conditional statements. So it will show you the different types of conditions that you have, such as equal to, less than, greater than, not equal to, and all of that good stuff. If you want to have access to that video, the link for it is in the description. But for now, the condition that we're going to use is I is less than 5. Now, the last piece of information that you want in here as part of your loop is code which is going to be called after every iteration of this loop. So after every time this body has been called, it's going to do this code. So for us, what we're going to be doing is simply taking our variable with the name I that we've already created and just adding 1 to it. And if you break down that loop, essentially it's going to add 1 each time, and once it is no longer less than 5, it's going to stop running this loop. So what we should have is code which is run 5 times. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do I plus 1, and then this time we are not going to be using a semicolon, just leave it as it is. Now, when you're just adding 1 to a number, instead of doing I plus 1, what you can also do is simply I plus plus, and it's going to save you a little bit of time. So now that we've got the basics of our for loop out of the way, what we need to do now is move on to actually creating the body for our for loop. The body of our for loop being the code which is going to be executed every iteration of this loop. So what we're going to do as part of this loop is have some text printed onto the screen 5 times. So what I'm going to do is simply create the body by using the curly braces, and then within this we're just going to simply run our code. So what we're going to do, std : cout, and then we're just going to feed into that a little piece of text which is just going to be, this is a for loop. And then we're just going to add in the new line function to keep this clean and end off that statement with a semicolon. So if we go ahead and debug our code now, what we're going to have on our screen is our code being run 5 times. So essentially you can see how this is going to save us a little bit of time. It is going to run that code 5 times until that condition is false. So now that we've actually got our for loop in place, what I'm going to do is break down the process in which it's going to run the different pieces of code so you can fully understand how a loop is going to work. So first and foremost, you have got your for loop. The first thing that it's going to do, and only do once, is look at the variable declaration. So it's going to declare this once and declare it once only. And this is going to be the very first bit of code that it's going to process. And then moving on from there, what it's going to do is its conditional check, which is going to check to see whether or not that condition returns true or false. If it returns true, then it's going to run this loop, and that is the code within the body. If it's false, it is going to move on to the next line of code within our CPP file, that simply being std::cin.get, which is essentially just going to stop our application from closing. So if the condition returns false, it is not going to run this code and move on to the next line outside of the loop. If it returns true, it is going to do the body. Once it has processed the body, it's executed the code within there, it is then going to run this last bit of code, which is essentially just going to iterate for us, so add 1 to our variable. And essentially what it's going to do with that is it's then just going to cycle round the code. So like I said before, it's only going to do the variable declaration the once. So after it's done that iteration added to our variable that we've got here, it is then going to check the condition to see whether or not it's true or false, and then just execute the body until it is no longer true. So hopefully that is everything you need to know about a for loop. What I also wanted to do is show you just how powerful for loops are and how flexible for loops are as well. So what I mean by that is you can actually move parts of the loop around, including them in the body, as long as the behavior stays the same. So let me go ahead and show you exactly what I'm talking about. So with this variable declaration that we've got here, we don't actually have to have this inside of our for loop. If we wanted to, we could go ahead and delete this and simply just put this outside of the loop. So the point that I'm trying to get at is the fact that you can use variables outside of that for loop, so it doesn't have to be created within there. But what you do need to do is simply make sure that that variable does exist and then include it within your condition that you've got. But what you do need to do when you are keeping this variable declaration outside of the for loop is just add in that space within the brackets there and add in the semicolon so it knows exactly what type of statement you're putting in there, as there is 3 types of information being expected. What you can also do is take your iteration code and put this into the body as well. So as you can see within our loop that we've got here, at the moment we are doing I++ as part of that loop itself. We can actually take this out and then include it as part of the body if you wanted to. So you could do I++ and then end off that statement with the semicolon, and it's going to do exactly the same thing as before. So if I go ahead and debug this, you are going to see it's going to simply print onto the screen, this is a for loop 5 times. Now, in some cases, you are going to want to write your loop in one way, and in some cases, you're going to want to do it differently. For example, if you have that variable already, you're going to want to put it outside. So for whatever reason, if you need to put your iteration code into your body, you can also do that. So I want you guys to understand just how powerful and flexible it is, and hopefully this is giving you a basic understanding of how you can do just that. Now, the last thing I wanted to show you with a for loop is that you can actually create an endless loop to essentially keep running our code. And the way that you're going to do this is by taking our condition and simply putting in there true or false. So if you want this to run endlessly, it's going to have to be true, which is just going to simply be true instead of an actual condition. And then if you go ahead and run this, what it's going to do is just endlessly run that code there and just endlessly run. This is a for loop. Now, one thing you do need to be careful with this is very quickly, if you don't have something which is going to stop this process, it can fill up your memory and run that. You can see this as part of our debug window on the right there. Now, that is everything for loops, and what we're going to do now is move on to a while loop. So a while loop is very similar to a for loop. However, at the beginning of a while loop, you don't have the option to use a variable declaration, and you don't also have the ability to add iteration code at the end. It is simply just going to be a condition within that. So let's go ahead and create a while loop. So with our while loop, what we're doing, because we don't have the option to have a variable declaration inside of it, we need to make sure that this variable is declared outside of that loop, as you can see that I've done here. Int I equals 0, so just make sure that is outside of the loop, as you're not going to be able to do it inside of it. So go ahead and type in while, which is going to be our keyword, and once again we have got our brackets, and within these brackets what you're doing is essentially just putting in that condition. So it's going to run this loop while this condition is true. In this case, we are simply going to do I less than 5, and then with that we are not going to be putting in a semicolon in there. You do not need it as part of a while loop. And the reason for that is because it's only expecting one type of information, so as such you don't really need to tell it this is the end of a statement. It's all going to be included as part of those brackets. So now that we've got the basis for our while loop, once again all we're doing is simply adding in our body. Our body is going to be created within our curly brackets, so go ahead and add those in there, and then just add in any code that you want to happen. For us, in this case, it's going to be text being printed onto the screen, which is just going to say this is a while loop. So what we're going to do is std cout, and then we're just going to feed into that this is a while loop with the new line function on there, and then just end off that statement with a semicolon. So what we also need to do as part of this is, because we don't have that iteration code as part of the top section of our loop, we essentially just need to add it in here. So just like before, what we're going to do is I++, and then end off that statement with a semicolon. So what you're going to get now when you run your application is something which looks exactly the same as your for loop in terms of what we've created. If your loop is not working for any reason, just check it against my code, and if you haven't still got the std can.get, make sure it is there, otherwise when your loop is finished, it is just going to give you an error or try to close your application. Now that we know how to create a while loop, you'll realize that they can do pretty much the same thing if you so please. Having said that, it's more of a thing of convention. You would generally use a while loop where a variable already exists and you simply want to compare it and don't have to change the value of the variable in each iteration. So like I said before, with your for loop, it's all a little bit more all-inclusive. You can add in your iteration code at the top and you can also do your variable declaration at the top as well. If you have a variable already, then you can simply just chuck this into a while loop and it's going to be a little bit more efficient and run a little bit more smoothly. Whereas a for loop, an example of where you might want to use this, is where you just want something or code to be run a specific amount of times and you're just going to be doing all of this within that one loop and there is no outside information that it really needs to access. So now that we've got that out of the way, what we can do is move on to the last type of loop that we've got, which is a do while loop. So in this section, we're going to be covering the use of a do while loop. Now, with a do while loop, they're not generally used that much. However, I am going to teach it to you guys as they do exist and they do have their uses within C++ programming. So a do while loop is very similar to a while loop. However, the main difference with it is that the body is actually going to be executed at least once, and then from there it's going to check the condition and run that loop over and over again until the condition returns false. So what I'm going to do is show you exactly what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do is delete the loop that we've just created so we can create a new do while loop. So what we're going to do is start this off with the do keyword, and then with this we are going to have the body of our loop. And you'll notice this time it is at the very top, so it's going to happen before our condition. So the body of our do while loop is going to be anything that you want it to be. In this case for us, once again, it was going to be text that we're going to be printing onto the screen. So we are going to do std cout, and then we're just going to feed in a bit of text, which is just going to be, this is a do while loop. And then with this, we are going to add the new line function to keep it nice and clean within our application. So just finish it off just like that. And then with this, if you need to add iteration code, you need to keep it within the body of this. So we're going to do I++ and then end off that statement there. What we're going to do just at the end of our body that we've got here, we are going to do while and then add in those brackets and add in a condition. So we're going to do while I is less than 5, run this loop. So essentially what it's going to do is run the code within the body once to start with, regardless of whether or not this condition is returning true. And then it's going to do that conditional check to see whether or not the condition is true. If it is, then it's just going to do the body over and over again until this condition returns false. So if we go ahead and hit debug on this, we should be able to see that our loop works. It is going to say this is a while loop 5 times. So with this loop, once again, you can do very similar things to what you can with the other loops. However, the difference that I want you guys to take away from this is simply the fact that with this do while loop, it is going to do is execute the code once, and that is going to be regardless of whether or not the condition is true or false. It's going to run it once first, and then it's going to check afterwards, and then just keep on looping that until it returns false. So that is pretty much everything that you guys need to know about loops for now. Once again guys, thanks for watching, stay awesome, keep creating. Your boy Virtus, signing out. This video was made possible by my supporters on Patreon. If you want more videos like this, check out my Patreon page using the link in the description. To stay up to date on new releases, make sure you follow us on social media.